Growing cut and come again vegetables is a great way to grow more food with less work, and I think it's always better to work smarter, not harder. Hey guys, and welcome back to Mini Urban Farm, a channel about urban gardening and homesteading in the suburbs. In today's video, we'll be talking about cut and come again vegetables, which are my favorite type of vegetables to grow because you get more of a harvest in a shorter amount of time, and I have very little patience for waiting 3 or 4 months for root vegetables to grow. Now, I do still plant a lot of root vegetables, especially in the fall season. However, cut and come again vegetables make up the majority of my vegetables in my garden just because I'm able to get so much more harvest out of them, and it requires less work for me to keep planting things out. They can stay in place all season long, and I don't have to worry about replanting. So if you're not familiar with what a cut and come again vegetable is, it's basically just a vegetable plant that you plant once, you continue to cut it down, and it will regrow, or you take the fruit from it and it will continue to produce, instead of root vegetables and other types of vegetables where you plant it out once, you rip up the entire thing. Like carrots, for example, when you plant them out and then they're ready about 3 months later, you rip up the entire vegetable and then you're done. You have to replant. With root crops, when you plant one seed out, you get one vegetable in return for that one seed, and then you have to plant again if you want more of those same vegetables. But with cut and come again vegetables, you plant it out once, and no matter how many times you continue to cut it down and harvest it, basically, you get a new plant coming back up in its place. It will continue to regrow itself until it is no longer, the optimal conditions for that plant to grow, the temperature gets too hot or too cold, or the season is over. And for this video, I also wrote a blog post about the best cut and come again vegetables, so if you want to read that and save it for later, I will leave the link in the description below. But let's just go ahead and jump into the best 10 cut and come again vegetables that I grow in my garden. Alright, so first up on the list is Swiss chard. Now, I grow Swiss chard all year round here in Florida. We are in zone 9B, so you can grow Swiss chard the entire year pretty much. I've grown it in containers, and now I grow it in my raised beds the majority of the time, but it does really well in pots also. Swiss chard is a really versatile vegetable. You can cook it, you can use it as salad greens. I also feed it to the chickens. And because it is so versatile, I usually grow a lot of Swiss chard. This season I opted to limit the planting space of Swiss chard just because I'm growing so many other things, but I knew I still had to include it in the garden because it is such a great vegetable to grow. Now, next up is green onions, or scallions. I actually grow scallions all year round. I usually don't start them from seed. I usually go to the grocery store and get an organic bunch of green onions. They are under $1 per bunch. As long as they have the roots on them, which they usually do, then you can just take them directly and plant them in a pot. I've actually planted them in raised beds for several years. This year I opted to plant them in containers, which works out really well because then you can move the containers around closer to the kitchen, which works out perfectly because using scallions is a great way to replace onions and gives you a lighter onion flavor. So next up is kale, and kale is a great salad green to grow. I grow it year round. It does really well in colder climates as well. I've never had a problem with growing kale in the heat either. So I grow red Russian kale, which it produces really well, and it is pretty hard to kill off actually. So I have cut it down several times and it just keeps growing back in the garden. You have to get rid of the entire plant and then some to actually get rid of the roots completely if you don't want it to keep regrowing. So this is a great example of a cut and come again vegetable because you just keep cutting it and it keeps producing, and you can actually start harvesting kale after about 3 weeks or 4 weeks. You can start harvesting the baby greens for kale, which makes for great salads, and you can make kale chips out of them. Next on the list are beans, specifically pole beans. Now, if you're familiar with cut and come again vegetables, this is not usually something that you would think of when you think about cutting down an entire plant like kale and it regrowing itself. However, I'm going to include it in this list because you do pick off the beans and it will just keep producing as long as the conditions outside are subjective to growing beans. Now, I like growing pole beans specifically. I do grow bush beans as well, but pole beans, they just continue to grow and produce, and I can just trellis them all over. As you can see here, there's some beans growing already. They grow up and around all my trellises, and you can actually cut back the plant quite a bit, and it will just continue to grow. So beans are a great cut and come again vegetable for a small space. And the same is true about indeterminate tomatoes. Now, I grow indeterminate tomatoes every single year. I grow multiple varieties of indeterminate tomatoes. Here in Central Florida, they grow pretty much year round. They are a great crop if you want to have something producing from the almost start of the season until the end of the season. My grape tomatoes, which are indeterminate tomatoes, they produce nonstop. As many times as you can pull off the tomatoes off of the vines, they will continue to regrow themselves. They grow their little flowers, their little pretty little yellow flowers, and they will just continue to produce and produce. Now, when the vine gets too big, I actually go and cut it back substantially. I have cut back more than half of the vines of my tomato plants before, of my indeterminate tomato plants, and they will regrow themselves. So I am going to include it on this list as well as a great cut and come again vegetable, in the sense that you can actually take all of the fruit off of it. It will continue to regrow the fruit. You can cut back the entire plant quite vigorously and it will regrow itself. So if you're not growing indeterminate tomatoes, then I would definitely recommend that you do. They are so versatile, and you can do so many things with them in the kitchen, and they're also great to just pick off the vine and eat them while you're walking through the garden. Next up is spinach. Now, I love planting spinach in the fall season because it is a cool weather crop. It doesn't really do too well in heat, although you can find some very heat resistant varieties of spinach. I opt to plant it out mostly in the fall season, and it does really well. It is one of the best cut and come again vegetables because it is so versatile. You can use it as leafy greens for salads. You can use it for dips and cooking, all sorts of things you can use spinach for. So one of my top recommended cut and come again vegetables. Next up on the list is arugula. Now, I have arugula in my garden all year long. It grows here without a problem in the heat. It also does really well in the cooler temperatures. We get down to the 30s, sometimes even high 20s here in the wintertime, and it does pretty well. I grow arugula mostly to use for salad greens and to use in eggs in the morning, right? If you saute it, it has a really nice milder flavor for cooking, and I also feed it to my chickens and they absolutely love it. So arugula is a great versatile cut and come again crop. Now, I direct sow on top of the soil, right? I don't cover it or anything. I just take my little seeds and basically throw them on top of the soil every season, and then within 3 weeks or so I have arugula baby greens to harvest from, and then they just keep growing from there. So I just cut and I take like a bunch of arugula all at one time. I cut it with scissors, and then about 3 weeks later I have an entire another set of leaves coming from those same branches. I generally plant about 4 square feet or so of arugula. In the past I have planted more to feed to the chickens, and then it does tend to grow pretty fast. So this season I limited myself to only 4 square feet, and that works out pretty well in my raised beds. There's not that many pests that get to it now. I know that I say that now, and after this video that comes out, I'm sure it will be covered with pests once that has come out of my mouth. However, up until this point, I have not had so many problems with arugula. Sometimes it gets leaf miners or something, but it's really easy to fix that, and it's really just a great cut and come again vegetable to have in your garden. The last two on my list are asparagus and artichoke. I am going to include them both together because of the way that they grow. So if you plant out artichoke and asparagus, you will have to wait for approximately 2 to 3 years before you get a harvest out of them. For that reason, I don't plant them in my raised bed garden, but on the new property that we have, I will be planting them out in the food forest because you can plant them out, leave them there for quite a bit of time, and not have to really worry about them. And after that 2 to 3 year period, then you can start to take a harvest from them. Now, they are a great cut and come again vegetable because once they are established, and after you have waited the 2 to 3 years for them to start producing flowers, then you can continue to cut them and they will regrow themselves. They are perennial, but you will have food from artichokes and asparagus for several years to come once they have reached maturity. So if you have some space in your raised bed garden, or if you have some space in ground that you can sacrifice to a few years worth of food production without retaining a harvest, then those two are great options because you will continue to get harvest from them after that initial growing period. Alright, so that wraps up this video on the best cut and come again vegetables to plant out in your garden. If you have any others that you grow in your garden that I didn't include on this list, be sure to include them in the comment section below, and like and subscribe if you did enjoy this video for more urban homesteading, more urban gardening, more urban chicken videos, all of that good stuff. I will see you in the next one.